Hello. Good to see everybody. Well, I can't see you. It was good to see everybody's eyes this morning. Uh, hope you all are doing okay. You may notice that the angle is a little bit different this afternoon. My preferred lecture chair that I've been using has been commandeered. So I'm just in this chintzy little folding chair. So things are not as awesome as they normally are, but we'll do okay. So, but maybe you can get a look at a few of my other books. That way, I can get in trouble for that. No one's gotten mad at me or criticized my book collection yet, so that's good. No, I'm not wearing a tie, Derek. I've not worn a tie for any of the live streams, I believe. Donnie, I think, says that he's been wearing his bow tie for the live streams, so that was good to hear. Maybe I should have put a bow tie on this evening in solidarity for my best friend Donnie, who I am so much gladder to see than I was to see Derek. It's really awkward when I tell a joke that I think is hilarious and all I hear is silence. No, but it's good to see everybody on this afternoon for our afternoon Bible study. As we said, we're going to look at the book of Esther this evening, and I thought about it, worked on it a little bit, and decided that it might be profitable to go ahead and just read through the book of Esther. So I timed it. It takes it's a reasonable amount of time, and so we'll go ahead and read the book of Esther together, and then make a few comments there at the end that hopefully can be of some benefit. I think it'll be good. I think hopefully that'll be beneficial. Just a second. Sorry about that. My office has its own AC unit. I normally turn it off because it's loud. But anyway, so Esther, Book of Esther this evening. Couple little notes of background that I think are interesting. The Book of Esther obviously takes place during the reign of the Medes and Persians. This is after a lot of the exiles have already started to return to Jerusalem and begun to repopulate, rebuild in Jerusalem. So Esther and Mordecai and those Jews that are left in the citadel of Susa are those who did not return to Jerusalem with a lot of the other exiles, which I think is an interesting kind of note. But that's kind of the context here a little bit. So this is after Daniel. This is after a lot of the things that we've already talked about in terms of this exilic period, and it takes place around that time. So without any further ado, we will jump into the book of Esther. Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. And while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. And at this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Kashirna, Sheshthar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marshina, and Mamukin, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because has she not performed the command of the king Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Mamukin said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Mamukin proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let the beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period for their beautifying, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge over the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of the king Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one is allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king, to beg his favor, and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except to the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I haven't been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. But Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced with him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. On that night, the king couldn't sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And so he said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let the royal robes be brought in, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king is ridden on, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry! Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men or women, I would have been silent. For our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." And King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who dared to do this?" And Queen Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." The king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. And when the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" The king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the third month, which is the month of Silvan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought them harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parishandatha, and Dalphin, and Aspatha, and Paratha, and Adalia, and Aridatha, and Parmashta, and Arisa, and Aride, and Vaistha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they laid no hand on the plunder. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, "In Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the kingdom's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but laid no hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold on the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness, and feasting as a holiday, and as a day in which they send gifts of food to one another. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to that what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that those days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, and words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. King Ahasuerus imposed a tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews, and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. The story of Esther in full. There you go. It's a fascinating tale, isn't it? It's interesting. It's a really good narrative to read all the way through. Hopefully, you all benefited from that, and hopefully, I did at least a little bit of justice to the text there. It's a fascinating book, one that some notable theologians of the past said shouldn't be in the Bible. I don't know that necessarily is right. We've got it in our book, in our Bibles. We've got it with us to read, to study, and there's a lot of powerful lessons we can draw from the book of Esther. A couple things to kind of point out maybe about the story that are just of a little bit of interest. the first thing that always stands out that we all know about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned anywhere in the book. And surely you notice that glaring absence in the speech of Mordecai to Esther, and the recognition that the people had uh, for Mordecai and for Esther. Nowhere is glory or credit given to God, and it's kind of an ominous sort of something that's missed in the text, and that seems to be somewhat intentional. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. One of the things that's always interesting about the book of Esther that I've always wondered about a little bit is the whole first part with Queen Vashti. I've heard lots of different things about Queen Vashti, whether or not what she did was right or wrong. Um, all sorts of suggestions that maybe the queen was asking Vashti to do something inappropriate, which is why she refused to come. That it was the seventh day of the feast. Everybody has been taken of the libations generously. So at this point in time, they are not acting as appropriately as they may have on the first day. Sorts of indications people have maybe tried to make about that. And so the king then is asking Vashti to show herself off in a way that would have been inappropriate for her to do. And so Vashti protects her honor by not coming. Maybe that's the case. Text really doesn't make clear the details of that. I've heard good cases for that. I've heard good cases for the fact that she is just being disobedient to the king and didn't want to come. But one of the things that is interesting to me about this book, and especially in regards to the way that it starts with Vashti, is that there seems to be something about that that is important to the story of Esther. Not just that, okay, there's an opening for a new queen, because you could skip this whole thing about chapter 1 and the bragging about the king and all this sort of stuff and easily transition into the king needs a new queen. But this is included. And so why? Like, what do we learn from that? We're talking about a book in a circumstance that's fairly unique because, we're familiar with Daniel and his role within the court of the king, Nehemiah, his role within the court of the king, and the things that they provided for the king, either cupbearer or prophet, wise man, that sort of thing. The way that they rose to their position of power to help protect the people of God, to Nehemiah eventually go back and lead his people and some provisions back for the rebuilding of the wall and that kind of thing. Daniel for the way that he interacted with the king and stood up for his beliefs there. But the difference with Esther is that she's a woman, and that is significant. A lot of times in women's studies, we look at Ruth, we look at Esther, we look at these like female Bible characters that stand out, that there's a lot written about because, in some ways it's a little bit unique. And particularly in ancient times, to have so much time dedicated to women and women accomplishing so much. And I think one of the significant things about that here is that you get that established at the beginning. Vashti simply refuses to come into the king's presence during a feast, and she is immediately ostracized. And there's all this over-the-top language about all the bad things that are going to happen. And if you don't put a stop to this king, then everyone is going to disobey their husbands, and it's going to throw all these things into all this problem. Mamukin goes on and on about all the dangers of this, right? And the king says that, yeah, that's right. We've got to put a stop to this. And you're like, well, it's a little bit over the top, but if that's the reaction to Vashti, and if we just suppose that the whole issue is about her preserving her own sort of dignity, if Vashti preserving her dignity results in this sort of reaction from the king, then what do we expect is going to happen when Esther is going to countermand a written command of the king that's been sealed with his signet ring, that's been passed out to all 127 provinces? I mean, as of right now, this is something that happens in Susa, right? Vashti doesn't come into the presence of the king at his specific feast in the citadel of Susa. And so that's a fairly contained group of people that hear about that. But the reaction is we have to put a stop to this before women never listen to their husbands again. And so that really kind of sets the stage for how momentous it is that Esther goes into the presence of the king without having been called for 30 days and essentially requests him to repeal or to change or to undermine a command that he has sealed and sent across his entire kingdom. That is a much bigger deal for the king to do than what Vashti did. That is a much bigger, sort of reaction. And so it is striking to me that in a world and a society that marginalizes women in a way that I don't know that we really fully appreciate, that Esther stands up and does this thing. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing the way that that works out, and the way that she goes to the king, and she butters him up with the first feast, coming back to the second one. But that speaks a lot to the character of Esther. Um, she's not exaggerating when she replies to Mordecai, "Look, I could die." That's not her being melodramatic. That's her being realistic, I think. And yet she goes ahead and goes to the king and ends up saving her people because of it. The other thing that's always striking to me about the story of Esther, and we said this before we began, that this takes place after certain members of the exilic community have returned to Jerusalem. A lot of people have already returned. There's a community there. And yet Mordecai didn't take Esther back. I don't know what the options were for that sort of thing, but presumably he could have returned as well. But he chose to stay in Persia, in Susa. So what does that say about them, that they didn't return to Israel, that they stayed in Susa and all those sorts of things? In some ways we think, well, God cares about the people who returned, the Jews that are back there, and that's who he's concerned with, because you've got Ezra and Nehemiah that deal with all of that stuff. You got Malachi prophesying to them and all that kind of thing. But then you also get this book of Esther and this story of what's going on back in Persia. And ultimately, and some of this is Mordecai's fault, depending on how you look at it, Mordecai refusing to bow down to Haman is the reason why Haman decides to kill all the Jews. But nonetheless, this decree goes out to all 127 provinces of the king that all Jews are going to be killed. This is going to apply to the Jews that have returned as well. And yet, God has still found a way to take care of his people. We mentioned briefly the idea that God's not mentioned anywhere in the book. And in some ways, that omission actually heightens, I think, in some ways, this idea of providence and God taking care of his people. Providence is one of those really difficult things that we struggle with. We like to read Romans 8:28. All things work out for the good of those who love the Lord. God is going to take care of us and all those sort of things. We try to apply that in different places. But providence is one of those really difficult ideas and concepts that we struggle with as Christians. And we don't know how God is operating. We don't have the prophets telling us, explaining to us what he's doing, what he has done, what he will do. Not in the same way that they did. But I think the lesson still stands, that even when God isn't around, even when these people are still in exile, despite the fact that some have returned, even though God isn't mentioned, and there's no direct interaction between God and the characters in the story, God is still taking care of his people. And you're right, Scott, this decree by Haman would have wiped out the lineage of Jesus. It would have wiped out all the Jews. They would have been gone. I mean, this would have been genocide. And so this is a big deal, this decree and this thing that's going on. And it's a big deal that God is still concerned with his people and finds a way to save them. Lessons from Exile talked about that kind of cutesy way maybe of trying to find a theme through lessons where we're not able to meet the way that we normally do. I know we got to meet this morning, which was great, by the way, getting to see you all. But you think about this idea here, and I have no idea what's going on in the world. I have no way to understand that necessarily from some sort of providential way, but who knows that a year from now, 10 years from now, we look back on this time and we see something that God has accomplished for his people, something good that comes out of these things, some lesson, something for us to learn and glean from, some growth that occurs. In some ways, with these sort of difficult times, and especially with us getting out of the habit of meeting in the building together 3 times a week, and thinking about going back to that schedule, hopefully sometime in the future, as we try to figure out how to move forward with all this, it could be the case that as a group, as a church, um, that we dwindle. It hurts us. It tempers our enthusiasm. We struggle as a congregation and have a hard time getting back to even where we were. But maybe, hopefully, we can look at this time in which we're separated, and we can use it as a moment to learn and appreciate and reflect on how wonderful it is that we get to meet 3 times a week, that we get to gather together and sing 3 times a week together, that we get to read from God's word, study from it, that we get to pray together, we get to shake hands and smile. Those are things that maybe this difficult time can help us to appreciate more, so that when we are able to get closer and closer to the normalcy that we had before, that we grow and are benefited from it, that we are more enthusiastic, more participative with our energy and our thoughts to do what is right for God, because we've learned this lesson of what it's like to be without these normal opportunities that maybe we've taken for granted in the past. I don't know. Maybe that's just one way that maybe we could look at that and kind of try and see some sort of benefit from all this. But the bigger lesson, regardless of any sort of specific application, that I want us to consider from the book of Esther is that God takes care of his people. I say that a lot, comes up a lot. I feel like I say it to my kids all the time. We read Bible stories together. We're like, now this is an example of God takes care of his people. What does God do? God takes care of his people. Try and make them repeat it so they understand that. But that's a profound idea, that God is taking care of us. If we were together, that transitions pretty quickly into do an invitation, be baptized. God is taking care of us, promised us all this future and all those sorts of things. I'm not going to offer an invitation this afternoon that way, since we're not together, but just think about that. Think about the way that God, throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament, has consistently taken care of his people. The lengths he went to comfort us and to take care of us. So much so that he even defeated death by allowing his son to succumb to death. I mean, that's profound, to think about the way that God takes care of his people. And how amazing is it that we can consider ourselves part of those people, part of the people of God, that we are heirs according to the promise. I think that's amazing. And that's the big lesson that I always take from the book of Esther. That even those that have remained in exile, God is still with them. God is operating in ways that we don't understand to take care of his people. And maybe we suffer, maybe bad things happen to us, but we know that God has defeated death, that God has defeated sin, that the blood of the Lamb is able to cleanse us and wash us. And that is something that we should never take for granted. Hopefully that's of some benefit. Hopefully you appreciate the reading. I love that. I love taking time just to read through the text. And maybe we'll do some more of that at a different time, depending on how you all thought about that. But yeah, hopefully you all benefited from this short reflection on the book of Esther. Let's go ahead and pray together here as we close. God, our Father in heaven, we come before you now. We're so very grateful for the time that we have to read from your word. So very grateful, Father, for all these wonderful examples that are contained within your book that teach us about your loving kindness and your care for us. Help us, Father, to never lose sight of the fact that you care for us and are with us. And help us to be a glory to your name. Help us to have strength. Help us to be there for one another. And help us even through these strange days that we're trying to transition out of, to make the wise decisions for the benefit of all of us. Help us to ultimately make the decisions that help further your kingdom. We pray, Father, you'll forgive us of our sins. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. Well, good afternoon. It was good being able to spend some time studying together again this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Sorry, allergies making my eyes itchy. Appreciate everybody joining in this afternoon. And Wednesday, 7 o'clock, do another live stream before meeting again next Sunday at 10, face to face. It was so good seeing you all this morning. Hopefully you all are doing okay this afternoon. Um, if you think about it, let me know what you thought about the reading. If you want to do more of that at different times, I'd love to do it, but I want to do what's beneficial to you all. So we can try and do some different things about that. Maybe it's at different times, or maybe at some point get into doing those at like a Saturday or something, getting together and reading a text or something. So we can think about that. But either way, it was good seeing you all today. Appreciate you all joining in this afternoon. Hope you all take care. Pray for one another. Look for the emails, and we'll study together on Wednesday. Thanks. Have a good evening.